April 14, 1945. A makeshift dark room in Gotha, Germany. 300 hours. The room was a converted closet in the basement of a requisitioned hotel. The air smelled of chemical fixative and cigarette smoke. A single red bulb cast everything in the color of old blood. Technical Sergeant Arnold Samuelson, 31, from Brooklyn, New York, stood over a shallow tray watching an image appear in the developer solution. He had been a photographer for the Signal Corps for 2 years. He had shot combat footage in France, Belgium, and Germany. He had photographed tank battles and artillery strikes and the aftermath of street fighting in a dozen towns whose names he couldn't pronounce. He knew how to capture movement, how to frame destruction, how to make a still image tell a story that would matter to people back home who had never heard a shot fired in anger. But the photograph coming into focus in the tray in front of him was different. It showed a pit, bodies stacked in layers, bone-thin limbs tangled together in positions that only death could create. The contrast was sharp, every detail visible. Samuelson had shot it 30 hours earlier at a place called Ohrdruf, and he had not slept since. He lifted the print with tongs, moved it to the stop bath, then to the fixer. He hung it on a line to dry and started on the next negative. There were 43 more to process. By dawn, he would have a complete set ready for courier transport to Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force in Reims, France. He lit another cigarette and bent. Back over the trays. The order to photograph Ohrdruf had come. Directly from General Dwight, Eisenhower's chief of staff, less than 12 hours. After the camp's liberation. It was unusual. Normally, Signal Corps photographers worked on assignment lists generated days in advance, shooting planned events, staged briefings, morale footage for newsreels. This was different. The message had been brief and specific. Document everything. Full coverage. Priority transmission. No detail too small. Samuelson had arrived at Ohrdruf on the afternoon of April 12th with 2 other Signal Corps cameramen. Corporal James Blevins, 24, from Atlanta, Georgia, and Private First Class William Scott, 22, from Portland, Oregon. They came with 4 cameras, 60 rolls of film, and instructions that used words like evidence and tribunal instead of newsreel and morale. They stepped through the gate and understood immediately why the language had changed. Blevins took the first photographs. He shot wide angles of the camp perimeter, the fence line, the guard towers that stood empty. He shot the main gate with its iron sign. He shot the barracks from the outside, plain wooden structures that could have been storage sheds or tool buildings except for the faces visible in the broken windows. Then he stepped inside the first barracks and stopped shooting for nearly 10 minutes. When he raised the camera again, his hands were shaking enough that he had to brace against a wall post to keep the frame steady. Scott worked the interior shots. He moved through the barracks methodically, shooting bunks, the narrow aisles between them, the men still alive who sat or lay on bare wooden slats. He did not ask them to pose. He did not arrange them. He shot what was there, faces, hands, the striped uniforms that hung off bodies that had lost half their weight. He used available light only, no flash, because the flash felt like a violation he could not justify even to himself. Samuelson took the hardest assignment. He photographed the dead. He started at the yard behind the southern barracks. The pit was maybe 15 feet across and 4 feet deep, filled with bodies that had been partially burned. The SS guards had tried to destroy the evidence before they fled. They had poured gasoline or kerosene over the pile and lit it, but they had run out of time or fuel or both. The fire had burned through the top layer and then gone out. What remained was a mass of charred and uncharred remains tangled together. Some burned down to bone, others untouched, still recognizable as men who had been alive days earlier. Samuelson stood at the edge of the pit for a full minute before he raised the camera. He shot from multiple angles. Wide shots to establish scale. Medium shots to show detail. close shots of individual bodies, of faces, of hands. He changed roles twice. He worked in silence. Blevins and Scott were shooting other areas of the camp. The only sound was the click of the shutter and the wind moving through the pine trees beyond the fence. He finished the pit and moved to the storage shed. Inside, the bodies were stacked like lumber. They had been stripped of clothing, sorted by size. The shed was unheated, and the spring cold had slowed decomposition, but the smell was still overwhelming. Samuelson tied a handkerchief over his nose and mouth and kept shooting. He documented the stack from 3 sides. He photographed the hooks on the walls where tools had once hung. He photographed a pair of SS gloves left on a workbench near the door. When he stepped back outside, he walked 20 feet, leaned against a tree, and vomited. He rinsed his mouth with water from his canteen, reloaded the camera, and went back inside. By nightfall on April the 12th, the 3 photographers had shot over 300 images. They worked until the light was gone, then returned to their billeted quarters in Gotha and began processing. The film had to be developed immediately. It could not wait for transport to a rear echelon lab. The images were too important. The chain of custody had to be unbroken. Samuelson set up the darkroom. Blevins and Scott assisted, mixing chemicals, timing the baths, hanging prints to dry. They worked in shifts through the night. By morning on April 13th, they had a complete contact sheet set and 50 enlarged prints ready for review. The prints were delivered to Major Harold Mayer, 36, from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, a public affairs officer attached to 3rd Army headquarters. Mayer spread them across a table in his office and studied each one in silence. Then he picked up a field telephone and called Rems. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. When Mayer hung up, he turned to Samuelson. "They want another set. Full size, maximum detail. And they want you to go back." Samuelson nodded. He had known he would have to. On April 13th, the day German civilians from Ohrdruf were marched through the camp and forced to bury the dead, Samuelson returned with fresh film. This time, his assignment was different. He was told to photograph the burial process itself. The civilians digging, the graves being filled, the American soldiers supervising, the expressions on the faces of the townspeople as they saw what had been 2 miles from their homes for months. He shot over 100 images that day. Women in headscarves holding handkerchiefs to their faces, men in work clothes standing at the edge of the pit, staring down. A priest from the town, Father Ernst Vogel, 62, from Ohrdruf, blessing the graves with his hand trembling so badly he could barely make the sign of the cross. Samuelson captured all of it. One photograph became iconic, though it would not be published until years later. It showed a middle-aged German woman standing at the edge of a mass grave, her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide. Behind her, 2 American soldiers stood with rifles at rest, watching. The woman's face held an expression that could not be faked. Recognition, horror, and something else. Complicity, maybe, or the sudden understanding that ignorance was no longer an option. These images are not comfortable to look at. They were not meant to be, but they are real, and they are documented, and they matter. If you believe these stories need to be told right, subscribe. We're committed to getting the details correct, every time. By April 15th, the photographs from Ohrdruf were in the hands of Supreme Headquarters in Reims. General Eisenhower reviewed them personally. He sat at his desk with the prints spread in front of him and did not speak for several minutes. Then he drafted a message to General George Marshall, Chief of Staff of the United States Army, in Washington. The message was direct. Eisenhower wrote that he had visited the camp himself, that the conditions exceeded any written description, that photographic evidence was being compiled and would be transmitted immediately, and then he wrote a line that would shape Allied policy for the remainder of the war. The visual evidence is so compelling that it must be shown to the widest possible audience, both military and civilian, to ensure that no one can claim in the future that these crimes did not occur. Within 48 hours, prints from Samuelson's negatives were on their way to Washington, London, and Moscow. Copies were sent to the War Department, the State Department, and the Office of War Information. Enlarged prints were prepared for distribution to the press. On April 18th, the first photographs from Ohrdruf appeared in American newspapers. The New York Times ran a front-page image of the burial pit. The caption was clinical. German civilians bury victims of Ohrdruf camp under U.S. supervision. Stars and Stripes. The military newspaper ran a 4-page spread with 16 photographs and minimal text. The images were not censored. Editors debated whether to run them at all, whether American readers were prepared to see what their soldiers had found. The decision was made to publish in full. The reaction was immediate. Telephone calls flooded newspaper offices. Some readers demanded retractions, convinced the images were propaganda or fakes. Others wrote letters thanking the editors for publishing what they called the hardest truth of the war. Churches held special services. Synagogues displayed the photographs in their lobbies. In New York, an exhibit was mounted at Grand Central Terminal. 40 enlarged prints displayed on easels in the main concourse. Over 10,000 people viewed it in the first day. But the most important audience was not the public. On April 29th, representatives of the International Red Cross were brought to Ohrdruf. They were shown the site. They were given copies of Samuelson's photographs. They interviewed survivors who were still being treated in field hospitals. Their report, filed on May 2nd, used language the Red Cross had never used before in an official document: systematic extermination, industrialized murder, crimes against humanity. The photographs were entered into evidence. In May 1945, as Allied forces continued to liberate camps across Germany and Poland, the photographic protocols established at Ohrdruf became standard. Every camp was to be documented in full. Wide shots, medium shots, close-ups. Survivors were to be photographed. The dead were to be photographed. Guards, if captured, were to be photographed. Every image was to be dated, captioned, and logged. The chain of custody was to be maintained at all times. By the end of the war, Signal Corps photographers had taken over 80,000 images of concentration camps. The photographs from Ohrdruf were among the first, and they remained among the most widely distributed. In November 1945, the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg convened. The prosecution, led by American Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson, 53, from Spring Creek, Pennsylvania, opened its case with evidence, documentary evidence, logbooks, orders, records, and photographs. On the second day of the trial, the court was shown a film compiled from Signal Corps footage. It included scenes from Ohrdruf, Buchenwald, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen. The film ran for 40 minutes. The courtroom was silent. Several of the defendants looked away. Hermann Göring, former Reichsmarshal of the Luftwaffe, sitting in the front row of the dock, stared straight ahead with no expression. When the lights came back on, Justice Jackson stood and addressed the tribunal. The photographic record is complete. It is specific. It is beyond dispute. These crimes were committed. These people died, and the men responsible are in this room. Samuelson's photographs from Ohrdruf were submitted as prosecution exhibits 2A through 2J. They were referenced in testimony from 17 witnesses. They were reproduced in the tribunal's final report, published in 16 volumes that now sit in archives around the world. Arnold Samuelson was never called to testify. He returned to the United States in August 1945 and was discharged from the Army in October. He went home to Brooklyn, resumed work as a commercial photographer, and almost never spoke about the war. In 1961, a researcher from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum contacted him and asked if he would be willing to donate his original negatives from Ohrdruf. He agreed. The negatives are now stored in a climate-controlled vault in Washington, cataloged, digitized, and available to researchers. In 1983, a journalist asked Samuelson if he regretted taking the photographs, if the images still haunted him. Samuelson's answer was recorded and later transcribed. "Every one of them haunts me, but if I hadn't taken them, people would say it didn't happen. And that would be worse. The photographs are still there. They are not hidden. They are not classified. They sit in archives, in museums, in libraries. They can be viewed by anyone willing to look. And they are specific, not abstract, not symbolic. They show real people, in a real place, who died in a real way that other real people made happen." In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of Ohrdruf's liberation, a memorial was dedicated at the site. The ceremony included speeches, prayers, and a photographic display. 20 of Samuelson's images were mounted on weatherproof panels and installed along the path where the barracks once stood. Survivors attended. Children of survivors attended. Arnold Samuelson, then 81, did not. He sent a letter instead. It was read aloud at the ceremony. "I was a photographer. I did my job. The men and women in those pictures deserve to have their story told. I'm glad I was able to tell it. I wish I hadn't needed to. The photographs remain at the site. They fade slowly under the sun and rain, and every few years they are replaced with fresh prints made from the original negatives. The negatives do not fade. They are stored in archival sleeves, in controlled environments, treated as what they are: evidence. Not of a theory, not of a narrative, of a fact. Ohrdruf was the first. The photographs taken there set the standard for what followed. They established that documentation was not optional, that the crime was too large and too deliberate to be left to memory alone, that if the truth was going to survive, it needed to be recorded with precision, with detail, with care. The camera does not lie. It does not editorialize. It does not soften or interpret. It shows what was there. And what was there at Ohrdruf in April 1945 was a crime so large that even now, 80 years later, the photographs still carry the weight of evidence that cannot be argued with. These stories are not easy to tell, but they are true, they are documented, and they matter. If you believe that's worth preserving, subscribe. We'll keep telling them the right way.